All right. So today, I didn't quite get to finish everything that I wanted to go into last week um, when we were talking about the Sabbath. And so what we're going to do is I got a few touch-ups I want to hit on. And it's funny because we kind of spoke about it today when they say that Christ rose on the Sabbath. So let's jump right into it. Go to Matthew 28, verse 1. I want to go to the scripture that they use because I think I just kind of skimmed over it last week, but I wanna make this plain. Matthew 28, verse 1.
Okay. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre.
Continue.
Verse 2. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone from the door, and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and become as a dead man. Verse 5. And the angel answered and said unto the woman, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Yeshua, which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come see the place where the Lord lay.
Okay. So this is dealing with when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to deal with Christ's body. And when they got there, Christ was gone. So let's go back. After reading that brief story, let's go back to verse 1, because that's the important verse that we're going to dissect today. Read it one more time for me.
Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre.
Okay. Now, this scripture, they look at it and they'll say, see, it's at the end of the Sabbath. And we know, according to the scripture, the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. So if it's the end of the Sabbath, then it's coming into the first day of the week. This is what they say to support the fact that we worship on Sunday because Christ rose on Sunday. And so it says, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, they came. And so when dealing with someone concerning this issue in this scripture, the first thing that that it leads me to say is, okay, first off, we see the scripture here, but let's say that Christ rose on the first day of the week. He didn't, and I'm going to show that tonight. But let's say he did. Where does it say, okay, since I rose on this day, we'll start to worship on this day? It doesn't say that. It doesn't come close to saying that. But more importantly, Christ did not rise on the first day of the week. And I'm going to show you what day he did rise on. Let's go, before this, let's go back into Matthew 26, and we're going to lead up to Matthew 28. We're going to follow Christ from the point of just before him being taken into the persecution and see how things play out. The scripture tells you what day he was crucified on. Let's go to Matthew 26, verse 17.
Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat? the Passover.
Okay, so the scripture says, now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Christ and asked, where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're asking him, where do you want us to what place do you want us to set up the Passover? So the Passover has not come yet,
Mm-hmm.
but they're making way to prepare for it. Okay, now this scripture always kind of threw me because it says, now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread,
Mm-hmm.
the disciples came to Christ and were asking him about this. All right, let's, I believe it's Leviticus. Let's go to, hold Matthews, because we're coming back. Let's go to Leviticus 23.
Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. Verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month, at eve, is the Lord's Passover.
Okay, so it's telling us when the Passover is. Now, we just left Matthew, and the disciples were asking Christ, you know, in Matthew it says, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples asked Christ where to prepare the Passover. Mm-hmm. So we see the Passover is the 14th day of the first month. Continue.
Verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread.
Okay. So the Passover is on the 14th day, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is on the 15th day, right? Mm-hmm. So how is it that on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples are asking Christ about where to prepare the Passover? Mm-hmm. If the first day of unleavened bread is after the Passover, why are they asking him about the Passover? Mm-hmm. Right? Y'all see that? Mm-hmm. All right, let's go back to Matthew 26. And this is why it's important to have a concordance. Mm-hmm. Because the translation can lead you, can be off. So when we look at first in the 17th verse, it says, mm-hmm. Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Mm-hmm. That first means the foremost, mm-hmm. or in time, place, order of importance, before, beginning, best, chief, first, former. So ultimately it means before or foremost. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying first, let's say before. It says now, okay. Before the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now let's look at unleavened bread as well, mm-hmm. because you got to get into details of this, because otherwise people can throw you off. So if you don't if you don't have access to what was originally there, then we left stuck thinking what someone may sway us to believe. But when we can get straight to the Greek, we have the key to getting understanding. So now let's look at unleavened bread. Now in the Greek, that the number to that word is G106, mm-hmm. and it's adzumos. And what that word means in the Greek, what is there in the Greek is not unleavened bread, but what is there is unleavened, that is uncorrupted, specifically the Passover week. So what this scripture is saying is, it's not saying now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but it's saying before the beginning of the Passover week. So this is why they're addressing the Passover, because this is before the Passover week. They couldn't have been in the Feast of Unleavened Bread before the Passover, because it's the day after the Passover. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, all these things are small things, but they lead to a purpose. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I want to make sure we understand step by step as I go. I want to make sure that everybody understands, each piece. So does that make sense so far? Yes. Okay. All right. So the Passover week is what the in the Greek it says, Yeah, in the Greek it says Passover week.
Mm-hmm.
So this happened on the first of Passover week. So they were making ready for the Passover previous to it coming later in that week. Okay? Now let's continue reading Matthew, verse 18.
Verse 18. And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples.
Okay, so Christ answers them in the week coming up to Passover. He answers the disciples that asked him about where to keep the Passover. He said, I will keep the Passover at the house with my disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this points to the fact as well, which we have dealt with already, that Christ kept the Passover. Christ kept the law. Christ kept the Sabbath. Continue reading.
Verse 19.
No, I'm sorry. Jump down to verse 34.
Verse 34. And Yeshua said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this night before the cock crows, thou shalt deny me thrice.
Okay, so this is Christ talking to Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making a timeline from Christ telling the disciples when and where he wanted to keep the Passover to the point that Christ rose.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to make it very plain the day that Christ rose. One point I want to add to this. We know that the Passover is the 14th day of the first month of the year. And we know that the first day of the year always falls on the first day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
So the 7th day of the year is the Sabbath. The 14th day of the year is the Sabbath. So Passover always falls on the Sabbath, or what we call Saturday. Okay? So that starts our timetable for Christ. All right? So the Passover, Christ kept the Passover with his disciples on the Sabbath, on the 7th day of the week, on what we call Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, read Matthew 26:34 again.
Matthew 26, chapter 26, verse 34. And Yeshua said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this night before the cock crows, thou shalt deny me thrice.
Okay, so this is this is Christ talking to Peter.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same night that he keeps the Passover with his disciples. This is after they've had the Lord's Supper, and after Christ had told Judas that he would be the one to betray him. All this is happening on Passover, at the Passover, because they came together to eat the Passover together that the disciples had asked him about.
Mm-hmm.
And so Christ said that this night you will deny me thrice, 3 times, is what he told Peter. And so I make point of this scripture because we're going to see that all of these events following that, have them having the Lord's Supper and eating the Passover together, and Judas betraying Christ, and Peter denying Christ, all happen in the same night. Mm-hmm. That's important because it's going to show what day Christ was actually crucified on. All right? Now let's jump down to Matthew's chapter 26, verse 73.